Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming today. My name is Selwa Shami. I'm the Assistant Director of the Montclair Public Library, and we really appreciate you taking time to come out today to see this event. Before we get started, I'd like to let you know about two Open Book, Open Mind events coming up after this one in November. The first one will be Thursday, November 7th at the Montclair Art Museum. B.A. Shapiro will be in conversation with Carolyn Levitt, and that will begin at 7 o'clock. And then later in the month, on November 22nd, we have Jodi Kantor and Megan Toohey, authors of She Said. They will be at the Central Presbyterian Church at 7 o'clock. Those events, that event, we're expecting a really big crowd. We already have over 100 people registered. They've been all over the news, so that's why we got a venue that can hold up to 500 people. So that should be pretty exciting. That's a ticketed event. You can purchase tickets at montclairplf.org. And you get a copy of the book with your ticket. So I would like to introduce David Jones. He is the former board member of the Montclair Library Foundation and co-creator of the Open Book, Open Mind series. He held various positions at the New York Times, including assistant managing editor, national editor, and editor of the National Edition. He is a proud graduate of Penn State University and NYU and is a longtime Montclair resident. So, David.
And he just had a knee replacement. I hope you can hear me. Got a frog in my throat. Good afternoon. We're privileged to have with us today two distinguished journalists and authors of national renown. Our guest, Daniel Okrent, and our moderator, Montclair's own John Alder, who's a loyal supporter of the Montclair Public Library, to discuss Dan's new book, The Guarded Gate. Dan's a native of Detroit, graduate of the University of Michigan, and worked early in his career with publishing houses, including Knopf, then had an outstanding journalistic career. He was managing editor of Life magazine. He was an editor-at-large for several years at Time Inc., Time magazine. He was the first public editor or ombudsman for the New York Times between 2003 and 2005, which is where we met, and is the author of 6 books. He's been described by Publishers Weekly as, and I quote, one of the most interesting and eclectic writers of nonfiction over the last 25 years. Dan is here to discuss his book in conversation with John, who will be the moderator. John's a graduate of Harvard. He's a native of Chicago. He spent 28 years as a columnist and senior editor for Newsweek. He's now a political analyst for MSNBC and a columnist for the Daily Beast. He's been dabbling in television, where this year was co-producer and co-director of the 2019 HBO documentary Breslin and Hamill, Deadline Artists. He's the author of 3 bestsellers, and if we're lucky, he'll be our guest upon publication of his forthcoming biography of Jimmy Carter next October. Dan and John will discuss Dan's new book, The Guarded Gate, which is subtitled Bigotry, Eugenics, and the Law That Kept 2 Generations of Jews, Italians, and other European immigrants out of America. It's a vivid and important history that resonates today. A question period will follow, and then Dan will sign his book out in the cafe. Please welcome Dan Okrent and John Alder.
Thank you, Dave, and thanks for all you do for the library and so many other things in Montclair. You're one of the town's great treasures. I mean that. So I'm not normally that effusive of a person, but I want to say before we get started that this book is amazing, and you all should read it. So I can't put it any more cogently than
Let's
that.
go home right now.
Yeah, we can go home now. So, I wanted to start by asking you about something you have in your, author's note or acknowledgments or something, a note on sources. You say that you originally used quotation marks around the word science, and that you then went in and took those quotation marks out. Why?
Well, the science that I'm referring to is eugenics, and I think what we would normally say, from what we know about eugenics today, science in quotes would be more appropriate. On the other hand, if you're trying to write a book in which you're at least creating the facsimile of fairness, then don't condemn it every time you use it, which the quotation marks would have. So I acknowledge that in its period, and my period that I'm writing about primarily is 1895 to 1925, it was accepted science. So let's let it have its moment, and let the reader decide.
Yeah, that decision struck me as being the right one because it reinforces what to me was this sort of shocking level of acceptance of what we now know is junk science at Harvard, Yale, Northwestern, in the not only in academia but in the heart of academia. Were you surprised at how scientifically respectable this was at a certain point?
I was, because from what we know today, we think back on people who are putting forward these eugenic theories and say, well, that is obviously not accurate. We have, in fact, built a country around ethnic mixes, and the eugenic science that was particularly the distortion that led to viewing heredity as something that is innate to ethnic groups, to nationalities, to races, preposterous. But at the time, science only knows what it knows today. It doesn't know what it knows tomorrow. And at the time, you can see how and why these institutions, in addition to the universities that John mentioned, the American Museum of Natural History, the leading natural history museum perhaps in the world, was the leading advocate of what became known as scientific racism. They didn't call it that. It was racialized eugenics. The Cold Spring Harbor laboratories, that was the place where the original so-called science came from. So imagine you are a graduate student at name your university studying genetics at a time when genetics had just been named in 1906. And all of this is surrounding you. So, well, this makes logical sense. So yeah, I can promote this science.
So let's just stop and define some terms. So, because there is this connection between Darwin and eugenics, and Darwin's son is in the book, and this guy, Francis Galston, who's a key figure in the book. Define the difference between genetics and eugenics.
Well, genetics is pretty simple. It's what do we have in our genetic makeup that we pass on to the next generation. At the time, of course, DNA was unknown. There were all sorts of different theories about what was being passed on. There was the belief that there actually was a particular genetic nature that was passed on in sperm and in the meeting of the sperm and egg, and it wasn't in any other part of the body. There hadn't been much science that had been done. But you mentioned Darwin. It does come right out of Darwin, because the key thing related to this subject about Darwin's discoveries, until that point, it was almost universally believed among scientists that we all derived from Adam and Eve. And if we all derive from Adam and Eve, we all have the same, they didn't know the term, genetic makeup, that we are all brothers and sisters because we come from the same source. Darwin establishes in the 1850s and 1860s that in fact we don't come from Adam and Eve, that we come from many, many places around the world, and that different ethnic groups, racial groups, evolved on their own. So the minute you make a distinction between ethnic groups, then that implies a hierarchy as well. So that the people who promulgated the ideas of scientific racism, they took Darwin as their hero. And in fact, the person who coined the term eugenics and who was the leading promoter of it in the UK, where it begins, in the 19th century was Francis Galton, who was Darwin's first cousin. And Darwin himself endorsed much of Galton's work.
Although at the end of Darwin's life, he had some real questions about it being applied to human beings.
Absolutely. So the other scientist to invoke is Gregor Mendel, working in his laboratory in the Moravian town where he is not his laboratory. He worked in a monastery, and he's matching pea plants. And that if we marry, if you'll excuse the expression, this pea plant to this pea plant, then we will the next one will either have white flowers or we'll have pink flowers. And this is really the core understanding of genetics. When that arrives in the U.S., the Mendels Paper was ignored. Nobody knew about it until 1900. When it arrives in the U.S. in the early 1900s, the American scientists who are beginning the study of genetics, they say, hey, it works for pea plants, maybe it works for people as well, which was a rather large leap. Just a little bit of a scientific explanation. There is a certain genetic component called a unit characteristic. The best known one among human beings is colorblindness. And that if you have a matching of two people who both have the recessive colorblindness gene, even though neither of them is colorblind, the offspring will have that. That's like a pink pea plant and a white pea plant. But there's a huge leap from that to intelligence, morality, character, all of which these scientists, there I go, I'm using the unfair quote marks, these scientists said, well, sure, if it happens with pea plants, why not with humans?
Or if it happens with certain physical characteristics, or even physical abilities, like today, a Kenyan once again won the New York City Marathon. So what do we know from the Human Genome Project now that the science is so much further advanced? What can we say with a much greater degree of confidence?
Well, we certainly know anybody who's gone to Ancestry.com or 23andMe, you're told what portion of your genetic makeup is from this part of the world, what portion derives from Neanderthals. But what does it tell us about those groups is a very, very different thing. I think that there's no question that if you took all the Kenyans, and everybody in Kenya and had them run, and everybody in the U.S. Who is not of Kenyan ancestry run, or pick any other country, the Kenyans as a group will be faster. But that doesn't mean that any single Kenyan is any faster than any single person from Montclair. Maybe I take that back. John's daughter was a star of the marathon earlier today, so there's an exception to that case.
So we're going to get back to eugenics in just a couple of minutes, but the story actually takes a turn into just pure anti-immigration or immigration restriction before eugenics becomes super fashionable and the two movements kind of merge.
Right.
So describe what was going on in politics and in immigration reform at the turn of the century.
Well, first a little bit background, if I may. The story of American attitudes toward immigration has been a sine wave since the beginning of the Republic. In fact, in the 1750s, a newspaper editor in Pennsylvania wrote an essay about how Pennsylvania as a colony was being corrupted by the arrival of Germans, and that the English language was being corrupted. That editor, obviously, was Benjamin Franklin. So it goes back to the heroic founders of the Republic. And then it disappears and comes back, disappears. Generally, anti-immigration feelings arise at times of economic stress, not always. The first big example of it is in 1882, the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, where the influx of Chinese laborers to build the railroads had reached such proportions that there was a huge reaction against it, particularly from people who were not employed, white Westerners, who had lost their jobs to Chinese because the Chinese were being paid less and were willing to be paid less. The labor movement has always opposed immigration.
Until now.
This is a big change, but
Yeah.
the labor movement, it ain't what it used to be.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, even Samuel Gompers, the founder of the AFL, he was himself a Jewish immigrant, and he was wildly against the continued immigration.
Yeah.
Anyway, it reaches a peak, its first peak, in the 1890s. The immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe had begun in the 1880s, but it isn't until the early 1890s that it really begins to accelerate, particularly Italians and Eastern European Jews. Many other groups as well, but those are the two that stand out. And in Boston particularly, a group of Boston patricians, Brahmins, they are horrified by what they see. They see that they are losing their city to these people who are foreign in every possible way. Henry Adams, he encounters somebody he describes in the education in his autobiography, a furtive Yitzhak or Yaakov reeking of the ghetto, uttering a horrible guttural Yiddish. I mean, he's reacting as if this person were from Mars. Henry Adams comes back to the U.S. in 1904, to Boston after many years away, and he has the same reaction to the Italians there. So the movement to restrict immigration from Eastern Europe starts with these Boston patricians, particularly the first Henry Cabot Lodge, who introduces a literacy test that would be applied in each individual's own language. If you can't pass the literary test, you can't come in. In his papers and even in his speeches in Congress, he points out they don't have very good education in Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. They can't read, and this is a way of keeping them out. The literacy test passes Congress 4 times over the next 21 years, and 4 times it's vetoed by presidents. But in the meantime, there's this building feeling primarily among Eastern aristocrats to keep these people
And it's
out.
vetoed by presidents in large part because they want the votes of the
Right.
ethnics in the cities.
Right. So enough of the ethnics had arrived already, and particularly in the cities. My previous book was a history of prohibition, and that's how I got into this, because the prohibitionists, one of their primary motivations was to cut back the political power of the tavern owners, who were largely Irish, but not exclusively, in the large cities. And prohibition was used as a weapon against them. And here, again, the anti-immigrationists were using a weapon of trying to restrict immigration, but there were people, many of them had votes. In fact, in Massachusetts, Henry Cabot Lodge, who was the leader of this movement for a quarter of a century, the Irish he accepted. They were white, and he accepted them because by then the Irish had been in Boston for 50 years, and they had a lot of votes.
And the progressive reformers, like the same ones a lot of whom were for prohibition, a lot of them were for immigration restrictions too, because they were trying to clean up the machines, and they were allied against them politically. So eventually it became a reactionary right-wing position, but early on there were a lot of liberals who were for it.
Early on, and some even later, as we were talking before.
Yeah,
but
we'll
one
get to
in
that,
particular, we'll
yeah.
get to her in a minute. But if you think progressivism in that period, of course, had a very different meaning from what it has today. Progressivism then was the belief that government could improve things, and that science was the proof of the proof, and the application of science would enable us to lift up the economic and even moral character of the country. Let experts make the decision. We bring in experts. They will make decisions that will improve things for everybody. So the idea of a eugenically based anti-immigration movement, it fit very neatly into that. And you find not just those affiliated with the Progressive Party. Theodore Roosevelt uses the term race suicide to define what the country was facing. And we know what race he was talking about. It was not strictly white, but it was Anglo-Saxon white. That was a term that was invented by a sociologist named Edward A. Ross at the University of Wisconsin, who was Robert La Follette's best friend. He was the man who invented tenure in American universities, and 30 years later, he became the president of the ACLU. He invented the term race suicide because he saw that these mongrels, the term that he used, were destroying America. And you see this repeatedly in the progressive and so-called liberal doctrine of the day.
So, and a lot of liberals fell prey to this. including some ones that might surprise people, right?
Well, I think that we're talking first about Margaret Sanger, and she fell prey to it. First, Margaret Sanger has been accused a lot by the right-wing anti-abortion movement.
She coined birth control and was the
Right, founded Planned
Progenitor,
Parenthood. She is the great demon of the anti-abortion movement, and there's been a strong effort in the last dozen years or so to make the case that Sanger believed in her birth control was a way to keep down the black population in America. That's totally specious, and I think I established why it's specious in the book. But as late as 1938, in her own memoir, Sanger writes about racial eugenics and how this was something that she embraced. And she worked very, very closely with the leading scientific racists of her time. Now, the one exculpatory aspect of this is I think that Sanger, like many people who are driven by one strong lifting idea, she would make any alliance she could that would advance her cause. So she wants to control the numbers of babies born into poverty into the U.S. by offering free birth control in the large cities particularly. Well, it happens that most of the poor people were recent immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. So her cause was picked up by the scientific racists. We're in this together. And in fact, there is a slight similarity because both the general idea of birth control and the larger horrifying idea of eugenic science is planned reproduction. That we have to have a control in place. Now, who exercises the control is a different question, but she remained attached to the eugenics movement through most of her life.
But this idea of the state getting involved in it, even Oliver Wendell Holmes was okay with that, right?
Yeah, the number of liberal heroes that I encountered in working on this book who embraced these theories, it was sad and it was shocking for me. And
Talk just for a second about that court decision where he upheld sterilization of prisoners.
Right, in 1927, the famous court decision in Buck v. Bell, where this was an attack, it was a test of a law that had been enacted in Virginia that gave the state permission to compel sterilization of men and women under state control, which meant mental hospitals, jails, almshouses, that if you were a ward of the state and the state deemed you eugenically inferior, they could indeed sterilize. The court decision that enacted in 1927, 1928 was an 8-to-1 decision, 8-to-1 decision. And the leader, the man who wrote the decision, was the great liberal hero, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who wrote in his decision, 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. Louis A. Brandeis, talk about liberal heroes. He was one of the 8 who signed along with it. Much of the rest of the court was conservative. Interestingly, the one vote against this law was cast by an extremely conservative jurist, Supreme Court Justice named Pierce Butler. And though he never wrote about it anywhere, it seems to me pretty obvious he was the one Catholic on the court, so that the notion of enforced sterilization was religiously offensive to him.
So you mentioned Louis Brandeis. He was the first Jew on the Supreme Court. A lot of the thinking was interlaced with anti-Semitism at that time, including among some people one might not expect.
Right. This is Brandeis is a really interesting case to study. Brandeis, born in Kentucky, comes to Harvard and then sets up law practice in Boston, becomes a partner and founds a very important firm. He is a leader of many civic movements. He belongs to every possible club you could belong to. But when his law partner got married, he wasn't allowed to go to the wedding because they didn't want any Jews at the wedding. So this is among the most enlightened people of the time. And to indicate how deeply held these views are, I quote a woman of very, very fine breeding and education who in 1918, I think she's 33 years old, writing to her mother-in-law, she had just met Felix Frankfurt, as it happened, at a party, and said he was a very interesting man, but very Jew. And another letter, after going to another party, she writes to her mother-in-law and says, "I would rather be hanged than go to another Jew party and listen to all that talk about sables and diamonds and money." And that person was Eleanor Roosevelt. See, I told you. Everywhere. And she's such an outstanding example because we know that she's the paradigm of tolerance. We would all cite her as the most open-minded and liberal person, people of difference. But if it's in, I'm not going to say if it's in your genes, but if it's in your mother's milk, as it was for the aristocrat, the Anglo-Saxon aristocrats of the Northeast, it was stranger to find one who wasn't anti-Semitic. And in fact, I believe the evidence pretty much establishes they hated Italians even more because they would meet an occasional Brandeis or a Jacob Schiff. And this was an educated person, cultured, knew which fork to use. Whereas by and large, the Italians they knew were bootblacks, fruit salesmen, unskilled laborers, and they thought that they were really less than human.
So before we get to some of the consequences of this, let's talk about some of the ways that this was disseminated. Who was Madison Grant?
Madison Grant is the man who brings together the eugenics movement and the anti-immigration movement. Madison Grant was, among many other things, an extremely wealthy, well-born New Yorker. He was the leading conservationist in the country. He single-handedly saved the redwoods forests of Northern California and is cited as such in preserves named after him. He kind of almost invented American environmentalism. He was a coterminus of people like John Muir, who was another colleague of his in the environmental conservation movement. He was the founder of the Bronx Zoo. And he wrote a book published in 1916 by Charles Scribner's son, my publisher, called The Passing of the Great Race, in which he took the theories of eugenics, that if you marry this person to this person, you will get this result. And he applied it to ethnic and racial groups. That was the first time it had happened in a large scale. In this book, he puts forth the idea of three distinct European ethnic groups. The Nordics, who are tall, blonde, moral, they are the leaders, the founders of the Republic. The Alpines, who are not so great, but they're okay. You got to have artisans around. Those are people from France, Switzerland, middle countries. At the bottom, the Mediterraneans, who were barely worthy of having as servants. And at one point, he writes in the book, in this marriage of science and racism that becomes scientific racism, he writes, "We all know from science that it's been proven that the marriage between members of any two ethnic groups will yield children that will revert to the lower of the ethnic groups. Therefore," he writes, "that the marriage between a Nordic and an Alpine will yield an Alpine, and the marriage between an Alpine and a Mediterranean would yield a Mediterranean. And the marriage between any of the three European races and a Jew, not European even, would yield a Jew." And this was the core argument of his book, which is then embraced by the anti-immigrationists who have failed. Despite passing bills through Congress, they can't get them past the president. This is embraced as what they needed to make it not discriminatory, but to make it scientific. So that the ensuing arguments are not about, well, we love our Greek neighbors, our Romanian neighbors, but as science has shown, and in 1921, an article appears in, of all unlikely places, Good Housekeeping magazine, which was a very powerful and important magazine at the time, that says, almost precisely, now that science has proven that these people, the Southern and Eastern Europeans, are inferior, it is necessary to have legislation to keep them out of the country. And that was written by Calvin Coolidge 1 month before he was sworn in as Vice President of the United States.
So describe the Immigration Act of 1924, Immigration Restriction Act of 1924, known at the time as the Johnson-Reid Act, and why it is one of the most important and insidious pieces of legislation in American history.
Well, in terms of important, Henry Cabot Lodge himself, who had been in the Senate for nearly 36 years, was the first man to be to actually bear the title of Majority Leader. He said that this is perhaps the single most important legislation that Congress has ever enacted. That was at a time when Congress had been in session for 130 years. Insidious will become clear, I think. Having failed to keep the Eastern and Southern Europeans out because of the literacy test that was eventually enacted over Woodrow Wilson's second veto of it, because even though it was now in place in 1917, what the anti-immigrationists discovered that in the years since they first propounded it, educational levels had went way, way up in Eastern and Southern Europe. In Italy, particularly because the Italian government recognized that Italians were being kept out of the U.S. because they couldn't read. So that doesn't work anymore. We have to come up with something else. And
Quickly on the Italians, just before you continue, because this always amazed me. 7 in 10 who came to the United States went back.
Yeah, the Italian immigration was birds of, I can't remember what, birds of passage. Italian men would come, live 3, 4, 5, 6 in a room, 2 beds, work, make money, and then go back to Italy. And then this was, as you said, those numbers. It was the country that was the largest source of permanent immigrants as well, but a majority returned home.
So when this bill is passed in 1924, what is the effect on immigration, and then what is the effect going forward into the 1930s and 40s?
Okay, well, first let me explain what's in the bill. In its 38 sections, the words Jew, Jewish, Italian, Greek, Romanian, no ethnic word appears. What appears instead is a new system of determining who can come into the country. It's a quota system that's based on the number of people already in the U.S. of a particular ethnic background. So that if 10% of the American population could trace their roots back to country A, then country A would get 10% of the new allowed immigration, which was cut to 160,000 a year. It had been, in the highest years, there were 1.3 million coming in from Europe. So they cut it to 160,000 years, and they make these quotas based on who's in the U.S. Now, you would think that they would use the 1920 census, which was at that point 4 years old. But no, they went back not to 1910 or even 1900, but to the 1890 census. Why did they pick 1890? That's before all the Jews and the Italians came. So the quotas themselves had built into them this very specific racial, ethnic animus, but not acknowledged. It didn't need to be acknowledged. The result of this was to take as an example, in 1921, there were 222,000 people who came from Italy. After the quota law, it was under 6,000 a year. Eastern European Jews, 95,000 to 4,800. The group that was most brutalized by this were the Greeks. The Greek immigration, there had been Jews and Italians coming in the 1880s before the 1890 census. The Greek immigration largely begins in the early 1900s because of conflict between the Turks and the Greeks. So there were very few Greeks in the U.S. back in 1890. The Greek quota is 100 a year. 100 people from Greece. So if you're Greek or you have Greek friends or relatives, you can tell them, you know when their parents came, when their family came. It had to be before 1924, almost certainly. So the result of this is a law that is in place for 41 years. From 1924 to 1965, that was the American immigration law. And we think that things are scary today. Imagine that. Now, what were the consequences of that? It's too horrible to talk about it, but here we are, particularly in the case of the Jews. If there were 95,000 Jews coming from Europe every year before this, and it was reduced to fewer than 5,000, so 90,000 a year, well, maybe they would have lost interest, so cut that number in half, 45,000. And then, during the Depression, people weren't moving around as much. They couldn't afford to get to the shipping ports. So cut it in half again to 22,000. And you can continue to bring that number down. But let's say cut it to 10,000. Well, from 1924 until 1945, 21 years. So 210,000, at the very minimum, Jews who would have come, who were not able to, and we know what happened to them.
So, and a lot of them were on the USS St. Louis, but when you go through that exercise, I think you say, well, I'm being very conservative in doing this. You get it all the way down to 10,000. But really, like, there were many more than that who were desperate to get out of Europe, out of Germany in the 30s, and then out of other parts of Europe in the early 40s. And so if the pre-1924 legislation had been in place, or there wasn't legislation, the pre-1924 system had been in place, the Holocaust would have claimed many
fewer. And as I say, there's no way of knowing. But however you
Likely
reduce it, the number is a terrifying
over
number.
1 million.
I think it would be fair to say over 1 million.
So,
And also, I think we have to extend that to other groups. I mean, to the number of Croatians that were killed by Nazi death squads, the number of people who starved and were killed by Nazis, the 300,000 in Greece, the estimate. Throughout Eastern Europe, the ravages of Nazi Germany were extensive, and there were many hundreds of thousands of others who died or suffered because of this law.
now in the period in the 20s before the Nazis, by the way, gave degrees, honorary degrees and others to these American eugenicists, and Hitler had Madison Grant's book, and it informed Mein Kampf, and it also informed the Great Gatsby. How did that happen?
Well, there's a passage in the Great Gatsby where Tom Buchanan holds up as a book. He's talking to Daisy and Jordan Baker and say, well, there's this guy Goddard, is the name he used, which is an interesting combination of two other names, who makes this case about how the lesser races, the colored races, but colored was very broadly interpreted, are taking over, and we need to do something to keep them out. So it's there in the popular culture as well. Just because we mentioned Fitzgerald, I think it's a moment to mention a resident of Montclair who was intimately involved with Fitzgerald, namely his editor, Maxwell Perkins, the most famous and honored editor in American publishing history, editor Fitzgerald, Hemingway, Thomas Wolfe. He published Madison Grant and many of the other so-called scientific racists. Does that make him an evil person? No. Does it make him complicit in an evil enterprise? I think so. And to be published by Scribner, where he worked for some 40 years, it was at least ironic.
And that's your publisher now.
Yep.
Yes, Scott Berg and his otherwise excellent biography of Maxwell Perkins should have had that.
He makes no mention of it. The exculpatory argument for Berg leaving it out of his Perkins biography is that Berg was a graduate student. It was his master's thesis originally, and so you go through the library, his papers at Princeton, and say Madison Grant, and you just go on to the next page. The less exculpatory version is that everybody that Berg writes about is heroic. Wilson wasn't a racist. Lindbergh was kind of anti-Semitic.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of the perils of biography. So other things, a lot happened in World War I to change things. I mean, the master race was Nordic, not Teutonic, because there was a lot of anti-German.
Right. The term that had been in use since 1899, a book published by an MIT professor named William Z. Ripley, was Teutonic and Alpine and Mediterranean. But once we're in the war, you can't use Teutonic anymore as the heroes. So suddenly they're Nordic. It's a miracle.
So once they're trying to establish these categories of intelligence, and the word moron is created in this period, they use testing, including the founder of the SAT, who's a believer in this shit until he recants eventually. Describe the testing that they did in World War I.
The testing begins as an effort to determine who is fit to be an officer, so that nearly every draftee in World War I was tested by a group of psychologists led by Robert Yerkes, now commemorated in the Yerkes Primate Research Center, important man in American scientific history. And they give tests of a variety of tests. One of them is a general information test where they ask questions like, Is Bud Fisher A, an outfielder, B, a cartoonist, or C, a member of the Senate? Or the Pierce Arrow automobile is made in A, Buffalo, B, Cleveland, or C, Indianapolis. And on the basis of these questions, they're determining levels of intelligence. And the man who created the SAT test writes the book, published by the Princeton University Press, published in 1923, his name is Carl C. Brigham, that uses all this evidence from the test to create a hierarchy of ethnic groups. And you'd be unsurprised by what the hierarchy showed. Of course, what it really showed was how long had people been in the U.S. You know, the Italian immigrant who arrives in 1915 is not likely to know where the Pierce Arrow is manufactured. The Anglo-Saxon or even the Irish, who's been here his entire life, he might know.
The amount of pseudoscience is kind of mind-blowing. So at one point you say there was something called eugenic celibate motherhood, and then you write, don't ask. So I am.
Oh, that's unfair. But that was written by a man named Paul Popenoe. Paul Popenoe wrote the first eugenics textbook. It was called Applied Eugenics, published in 1918, and was a standard textbook used for many years in many major American universities. He later became best known as the creator and author for decades of a feature in the Ladies' Home Journal called Can This Marriage Be Saved? He, in this book, he makes this case for eugenic celibate motherhood. And I say, don't ask, because I have no idea what he was talking about.
So, but you do unpack a sentence that reads, quote, Columbus, from his portraits and from his busts, authentic or not, was clearly of Nordic ancestry.
Stop. I mean, what a sentence. This was a sentence that was published in the New York Times in a piece by Henry Fairfield Osborn, for 25 years, the executive director of the American Museum of Natural History, one of the most famous scientists in the country. He was a paleontologist. He had discovered and named Tyrannosaurus rex. He was a cultural figure of a very large, like Neil Tyson today, perhaps, but without the television supporting him. And he writes a sentence that has in it, not only is he basing it on busts and portraits, but those words, authentic or not. Authentic or not. And he is making an argument on the editorial page of the Times about why this bullshit science, you said it first, is something that we need to pay attention to in our decisions on who gets into the country.
So this raises many contemporary questions, which I know that we're going to address and hear from you on, but a couple that come to mind immediately. This idea of a literacy test, it's essentially saying that if you're not wealthy and educated, you shouldn't come into the country, and that was the debate 120 years ago that Henry Cabot Lodge was launching. So hasn't that literally come back in just the last few months? Isn't there a Trump administration proposal that if you don't have skills or money, you should?
Well, not only is there a Trump administration proposal that says this, and of course Trump administration proposals also are keeping people out of certain ethnicities from certain countries, and this is very much an echo of what happened over 100 years ago. But the notion of skills in the last Democratic debate, or the one before that, I guess, Vice President Biden said, I want all the PhDs I can get. If that's our standard of allowing people into the country, then of course we're rewarding those who can afford an education and coming from countries where education is valued. Now, I see the virtue of bringing in talent. I mean, every country needs talent, but to have that be a divider that determines who gets in and who isn't is a little scary to me.
And the whole issue of science, and this is a more uncomfortable thing to raise because there is an attack on science, and we have an anti-science president and a lot of anti-science people in his party, particularly on climate change, but really across the board there's an attack on science. Is it sobering how should we think about science and politics in light of this junk science experience that we had that had such immense consequences?
I think we need to think about it with forethought, by which I mean science only knows what it knows at the moment. It doesn't know what it's going to learn tomorrow, 5 years from tomorrow, 10 years from tomorrow. I believe the climate science. I believe it to my soul. Why do I believe it? Because I honor the American scientific community. Was it any different in 1921 when the American scientific community, with nearly unanimous support, believed in eugenics science? Now, does that mean that the climate scientists are wrong? No, but it means we must think about it. It can't be, science isn't always what science is going to become. And sobering is the least of it. It's upsetting.
All right. Let's open it up. We have a little bit of time for questions.
One thing that, while we wait for the microphones there, but I was going to say, can you imagine, I worked on this book for not quite 5 years. These people were living inside my head, and it wasn't pleasant.
I can imagine. I'm curious, when they did the 1924 law, the entire national borders had all changed after World War I. There's no Ottoman Empire. There's the Russian Empire is smaller. Austro-Hungarians full. How did they come up with, if you're, whatever, if you're, I don't know, Polish, Poland can.
Yeah, somewhat arbitrarily.
That's right.
The best example would be, who's a Russian? If you're from Lithuania, and you're part of the Soviet Union by then, are you Russian or are you Lithuanian? So there was a certain amount of arbitrariness to it, but no matter how it was applied, those countries, the numbers were very, very low. So the complication almost became irrelevant in those countries.
And also the numbers for England were very, very high. How did that happen?
Because until 1890, where were the immigrants coming from? They were coming from the UK, Ireland, of course, which was part of the UK before World War I, the Scandinavian countries, looking at the population of the upper Midwest, and Germany. Those were the favored groups.
Right, and at that time, you know what they were called? Native American.
Oh, yes. The term that these people used for themselves, Madison Grant, Henry Cabot Lodge, was, we are the Native Americans, which is really too delicious to be horrified by.
Hello, thank you very much. How did they justify using the 1890 census?
They didn't need to. There was an article by a sociologist named Roy Garris, who taught at Vanderbilt, that appeared in, I'm not going to remember which very popular publication, that proposed this. And in his proposal, he made the case that, well, this will determine that we'll have fewer of these. He was absolutely direct about it. But in the congressional debate, it is largely avoided, the 1890 question. There are some particularly retrograde members of Congress who will invoke the ethnic nature of these divisions, but very, very few. What was very disturbing to me was to discover how many, not just liberal congressmen, but liberal Jewish and Italian congressmen made the case, well, we should let in the Eastern and Southern Europeans, but the Asians, they're not like us. And one of the people who made that case was Fiorello LaGuardia, who was the leading, his mother was Jewish, his father was Italian, he spoke Yiddish, he spoke Italian. He, of course, welcomed people from Europe, but he made the case that the Asians don't assimilate with us, so it's okay to keep them out. So it's an indication of the intensity of feeling at a time when the defenders of at least open European immigration feel the need to show that they too are concerned about the eugenic makeup of the nation.
Speaking of LaGuardia being an Italian, of Jewish and Italian extraction, what happened to some of the children of these eugenicists?
Well, one of the things that I learned is that everything that the anti-immigration scientific racists feared came true. They were right to be afraid from their perspective, which is to say their kids, their descendants, they don't get into Harvard automatically anymore. They don't run the country anymore, and a lot of them have married Jews and Italians. And The great granddaughter of one of the leading scientific racists of Boston, a man named Richards Moores Bradley. Her name is Sarah Richards Bradley Epstein. And so, yeah, it all happened.
Moldering in his grave. Are there, yes. Yeah.
Excuse me?
What do we have now on selecting who comes into America?
Well, until the Trump administration put in its rules, later upheld in the courts, although still somewhat under question, about certain Muslim countries and also certain Latin American countries, there was no, since 1965, when Lyndon Johnson signed the Hart-Celler Act that revoked the 1924 Act, signed it in the ceremony on Liberty Island in 1965. Since then, there's been no ethnic distinction. And I see this most clearly in two arenas. One is taxi drivers in New York City, who were at one time all Jewish, then they were all Italian, then they were all Hispanic, and now very heavily Asian and African. It's been open immigration until now.
Well, there are limits on legal immigration.
Yeah, there are gross numbers, but they are not assigned by nation. They're gross.
Right. So it's like buying a lottery ticket.
Yeah, it is exactly. It is a lottery. It has been an admissions lottery for half a century until the Trump rules.
But LBJ, one of his overlooked achievements, the Immigration Act of 1965, it changed the face of America.
Absolutely,
It
absolutely.
was, people who were not white were not allowed in at all, basically.
That's right. Somebody over here?
I was just wondering if Eleanor Roosevelt, if your comment was unique or if that was common with her. I have a friend who's Jewish, was a godchild of Eleanor Roosevelt, and her mother had been taken. Her mother, who had been ill as a child, was supported by Eleanor Roosevelt, and then my friend, played with her grandchildren when she was little. So I don't think that that would.
No, it didn't stay with her. Eleanor Roosevelt, I use as the example because we think of her as the paragon of tolerance, but we can also use her as an example of somebody who overcomes the limitations of her upbringing and begins to see that she's been wrong. And John and I were talking about this before. There are a variety of different reasons you could say, why did Eleanor Roosevelt change? But she very, very clearly changed. And I mentioned Edward Ross, the sociologist who coined the term race suicide. He taught at Wisconsin and was later the president of the ACLU. He published a book in which he recanted everything he'd say. He said, I rue these words that he had uttered over and over again in prominent publications for a period of 15 years. Carl Brigham, who analyzed the Army test results and published by Princeton. He remained on the Princeton faculty, and in 1930 he recanted. And he said, that there were all these cases, arguments made that we know today are false, and I have to say that mine was at the top of the list.
So I wrote a book about Roosevelt, and Eleanor, by the end of her life, almost all her friends were Jewish. So she really changed. And Franklin, who's often accused of anti-Semitism, you can't find any of it in his correspondence for reasons that we could talk about. So there's a lot of, these situations get more complicated depending on where they are at a particular time in their lives. So Franklin and Madison Grant had a kind of a little bit of a relationship, not as close as with Theodore, but
Madison Grant and Franklin Roosevelt grew up in the same very well-moneyed aristocratic Manhattan background, and they were friends. And Grant, who was really responsible for building like the Bronx River Parkway and such, he always would bring his friend Frank into these efforts. And as late as the time that Roosevelt is elected president, they are writing Dear Madison, Dear Frank letters to each other. Grant had become a pariah in most places, but sometimes blood is thicker than reality.
So let's just, I guess there's a couple more. I have one other that I want to ask you.
You didn't touch on African American or Hispanic population. How do they fit into the pattern of immigration?
Well, African immigration was virtually non-existent. And when the quotas were put in fact, there's an article in the New Republic that points out that under the quotas, Liberia was entitled to 1/2 of one person coming in a year, which was, of course, used to make the case that it was ridiculous. But even in African and Asian countries, the immigration, and this is a complex thing having to do with previous immigration and citizenship laws, was for white people from India, white people from Japan, white people from Egypt, from South Africa. So the admission of people of color was virtually proscribed. It simply didn't exist.
And they didn't
You
know.
see that the largest immigration among Hispanics, Western Hemisphere Hispanics to the U.S. was, of course, for many decades was Puerto Rico, which was part of the U.S. The Dominican immigration, which is much larger, begins in 1965.
And they didn't know how to deal with people from the subcontinent at all, right?
Right. There's a chilling Supreme Court case in 1923, Tind v. U.S. This is about a man who had come from India to study at Berkeley in 1912 because he was interested in American literature. And really his letters are really charming. He's very excited about Jack London and Hawthorne. 1917, 1918, he enlists in the Army. He doesn't go overseas, but he has perfectly distinguished Army service. He gets sworn in as a citizen at the end of the war, and a month later, he's told that his citizenship is being taken away from him because he wasn't white. Under the Naturalization Act of 1906, you had to be white if you weren't born here, you had to be white to get citizenship. So he not only had it, but he had it taken away from him. So he goes to court, and the Supreme Court in 1923, in a 9-0 decision, determines that people from India are not white, and he loses his citizenship permanently.
There's another category of people born here in this country for many generations who could be stripped of their citizenship, and that was women who
married the people who were proscribed. There's an extraordinary...
So you could have come over on the Mayflower, but if you married the wrong person, they could strip your citizenship.
That was
You were a
undone
woman.
in 1929, but there was a period when that was in place. It just, one thing after another. It's kind of staggering. There's a case in Alabama about a black man who married a white woman of Italian descent, and there's an effort to nullify this marriage because of the anti-miscegenation laws. And in court, the state makes the case that the woman from Italy can't prove that she's white because she's from Italy, and that proves nothing.
So I noticed that somebody took a swing at Henry Cabot Lodge. I had always thought it was just Charles Sumner and Preston Brooks just before the Civil War, but there are 2 examples in your book of fisticuffs in the Congress, and this reminded me that as upset as we all are about the level of tension in our society right now, tempers ran really high on this issue. Right?
They ran really high, and it doesn't encourage me about the nature of the American body politic. The case of Sumner and Brooks, which you mentioned, is of course from 50 years earlier.
Right.
But this was Charles Sumner being nearly beaten to death on the floor of Congress from a congressman from South Carolina, using a cane, smashing him over the head over and over again.
But maybe I was being Pollyannish about it, but that was just before the Civil War, so it was seen as being an indication that Civil War is coming. But in the case of these immigration debates, where these other, I can't remember the second guy who took a punch.
Well, he was not a member of Congress. He was an angry constituent who was pro-immigration.
Right.
He happened to be a minor league baseball player,
Right.
bizarrely.
But all of the
We took a swing at the 71-year-old.
By the way, it wasn't mentioned, but Dan, among other accomplishments, is the founder of rotisserie league baseball, which became fantasy sports, which is now a multi-billion-dollar industry. He started the whole.
That's why I'm so fabulously well.
It, just to bring it to the present, and maybe we have to leave it here, maybe, unless somebody else has something urgent. Madison Grant is now in these right-wing, white supremacy blogs. How worried are you about this kind of thinking entering the mainstream in a big way again?
Well, I mean, I think that anybody in the room could answer this with as much authority or as little authority as I can. We live in a very scary time. Obviously, the spread of information and, more importantly, disinformation in the digital universe has empowered and emboldened people who have thoughts that we would rather not enter the public debate. In 2015, Jeff Sessions, he was still merely a senator from Alabama and was first member of Congress to support Trump's campaign. He appeared on a radio show and said, we need to bring back the 1924 Immigration Act.
Wow.
So, it's scary times.
I have a question. Did the DAR embrace officially eugenics?
I don't think they embraced eugenics as such. They didn't need to, of course, because they had this time limit. If your family wasn't here by 1783, you couldn't be a member of the DAR. So that was pretty safe unless you were an American Indian. The DAR was among the many organizations of, depending on your perspective, do-gooders or charitable people who, in fact, they published a series of books, particularly for the Italians, about how to be a better American. Can't join my club, but become a better American.
Okay. Oh, we do have a couple more. Okay.
If you had to compare America and Germany in the 20s, would you say that with respect to scientific eugenics and scientific racism, the Americans were the pioneers and the Germans were the followers, and the Germans just acted on it?
The term I would use, neither was a leader nor follower. They were collaborators. I don't mean collaborators in the sense of a fifth column, but the leading American eugenicists were in regular touch beginning around 1906, 1907 with the leading German students of what was the Germans called race hygiene. Hitler, as John mentioned, he invokes Madison Grant and the 1924 Immigration Act specifically in Mein Kampf, cites Grant in speeches. But one of the authors of the leading textbook on eugenics in Germany came to the U.S. several times, collaborated with the people at Cold Spring Harbor. One of these men, became the rector of the University of Berlin and fired the entire Jewish faculty in 1933. Another was awarded the Goethe Medal by Hitler in 1939 for his contributions to race science. The Nazis really used this material. There's nothing in their work before the Nazis that shows that they were thinking this way. Neither had they become racialized in their science. But in 1946, the first Nuremberg trial, which is the so-called doctor's trial, the Karl Brandt, who was Hitler's personal physician and then later an important actor in the effectuation of Nazi race policy, his defense was, we did what Americans said. Look at this. Your scientists were saying these things. How can you accuse me of this? And I write in the book, not to quote myself, but I'm going to quote myself. I said, we're used to the self-exculpatory phrase, I was only following orders. But in many of these cases, I was only following Americans, would have been more precise.
And Hitler liked Henry Ford and the Dearborn Independent, and he had, but then he also miscalculated because he thought that we were a quote mongrel nation, So maybe his reading all of the eugenic accounts of how the United States had been mongrelized led him to underestimate our army?
That's a really interesting idea for a better historian than I, or at least somebody who knows Hitler's thinking far better than I. His citation of the 1924 Immigration Act in Mein Kampf is specific to German immigration policy. You know, who thinks about German? I guess Germans thought about German immigration policy, and that Germany needed to follow what the Americans are doing because they had come up with an immigration policy that was meant to preserve the best of America.
I think we had one more question, and that'll be our last.
I'm curious in this book project if your views on immigration shifted in any particular direction, because it seems the book itself obviously is highly nuanced, and so did your views shift in any way?
Oddly, yes, and not in the direction that you might expect. I felt, and I still feel, that there should be no racial, religious, ethnic preference of any kind. Do I think it's appropriate for a nation to have a ceiling, a limit on immigrants in any one year? This doesn't appear much in the book, but my study of immigration, particularly in times of economic distress, makes me think, yes, it's not unreasonable to say there should be 600,000 or 1 million, or I don't know what the numbers should be. But a numerical ceiling, which I'd never thought about before, I can see the economic argument. I don't want to end on that. You can think terrible things about
so
it.
you said the book, so I'll end where we began. So you said the book, you know, is very nuanced, and it is, but you're not, there's also a sense of moral outrage that courses through the whole book, and actually the way that Dan presents his evidence at times is amusing, if you can believe that. And there's nothing at all dry about it, unlike some of the eugenics tables and what they call them, trait books and other things that they had to categorize all of their junk science. So thanks so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you.
I wanted to thank Jonathan and Daniel. Daniel will be outside in the cafe signing books if you'd like to purchase one. I also wanted to acknowledge our supporters of the series, a grant from the Investors Foundation and the Montclair Foundation. So thank you for coming.